Shimla's mall was once compared to the most elegant streets of London, St. Petersburg and Paris. Along its east-west axis, people walked, rode and moved in rickshaws, past rows of fashionable shops and restaurants that were owned by both Europeans and Indians. A century later, the inhuman rickshaws are gone, but this stretch across the hill still retains its pedestrian character and much of its architectural charm. Placed in the mid-Himalayan ranges, with the mall forming its center, the town was originally built like a long horseshoe over a series of hills that face south. Just above the mall is the ever-popular ridge with its wide views and Shimla's signature on the skyline, Christchurch. And towering above is the wooded crown of Jakhu Hill and the age-old temple dedicated to Bhagwan Hanuman. From what was first described in the early 19th century as a nondescript village with a few miserable shepherds' huts, to transforming itself to the full-blown, power-filled summer capital of British India, to evolving as the state capital of Himachal Pradesh, the path of Shimla's story has many twists and turns. Every change, big or small, has left a mark along this long road and added to the town's personality and enduring mystique. As Shimla sent arteries and veins in different directions, and as the sinews of urbanization strengthened, so did its character. Taking a long leap over the decades, this created a fascinating mesh of history and heritage. This is a rare interface of nature, architecture, and event, encased in an aura of stories and lore. There is even a story behind the name Shimla. While no one knows the real story, different versions are given. The name of the original village at the site of Shimla is variously reported as Shimlu, Shimalia, Semla, Shumla, and Shemla. Another variation ascribes the origin of Shimla's name to Shamla, a blue or dark lady, another name for the goddess Kali, who is held in high veneration in these hills. For all that, as the summer capital of British India, the spelling was Simla. The official addition of the H that made it Shimla only took place in 1982. Easy accessibility, well-developed facilities, and an excellent climate have made Shimla one of the most popular hill destinations in India. Every corner has a piece of history. Every stone and brick seems to have a story to tell. For well over a century, a fifth of the human race was ruled from its heights. And echoes of its past, including many splendid pieces of architecture, still give the core of Shimla its remarkable character. There are deep valleys all round, while the distance shows the snow-clad peaks of the Himalayan mountains and its many hills. Forests of Himalayan cedar, the almost legendary deodar, pine, oak and flowering rhododendron, and a host of wildflowers surround the town and intertwine its inhabited pockets, creating what may well be one of the planet's last surviving natural forests in an urban setting. Expectedly, the way the town came into being and how it grew makes for a remarkable tale. The final years of the 18th century and the opening decades of the 19th were a period of considerable turbulence in the hills of the western Himalayas. The armies of Nepal had spilled over their borders and taken control of large tracts of North India, including large areas of present-day Himachal Pradesh. Deprived of their territories, many of the hill chiefs approached the powerful British East India Company for help. For a long time, this assistance was not forthcoming. Encouraged by their successes, the Nepalese armies began making inroads into areas that the British regarded as their own spheres of influence. Finally, the British raised 4 armies against the Gurkhas, as these people were now called, who were defeated in 1815. Interestingly, even while these wars were on, the British had started recruiting Gurkhas into their own army. A formal end to the Gurkha Wars came when the Treaty of Sagoli was signed the following year. The victorious East India Company restored most of the hill kingdoms to their original rulers, but decided to retain certain key positions as military outposts and as sanitaria. One of these was the tiny village of Shimla. The first permanent house, built in 1822, is thought to be Kennedy House, which was the residence of Charles Pratt Kennedy, the newly appointed political officer of the Hill States. This was located on the site of the present-day parking lot of the Vidhan Sabha. In 1827, Shimla was visited by Lord Amherst, the British Governor-General of India. And the following year, the Commander-in-Chief, Lord Combermere, also came to Shimla. Combermere was largely responsible for creating the trace of what is today's mall. He also built the first bridge in town, which still bears his name. These 2 visits, in a manner of speaking, gave a stamp of official approval to the fledgling town. From the time that Lord Amherst visited the place to the coming of Indian independence with a few interludes, it was from Shimla that the British ruled India for a better part of every year. The moment the summer temperatures rose on the plains, long convoys would start the 1,200-mile journey from Kolkata, then the seat of British power in India. In mind-boggling combinations of barges, elephant-back, camel-back, horseback, or on bullock carts, being carried in litters or walking, men, women and children, and government files would make their way up to Shimla. The government would reach these heights in early April and remain till late October, so it spent more time in the hills than the so-called real capitals, Kolkata and later New Delhi. Timed to the arrival of the government, shops that had been shut for the winter would reopen. Traders would return, and those who sought employment as porters, domestic staff and rickshaw pullers would migrate from the surrounding hills. The pocket of land that holds the town's core was acquired by the Governor-General Lord Bentinck in 1830 from the states of Patiala and Keonthal, who had earlier been given the lands for services rendered during the Gurkha Wars. In 1864, under the Viceroyalty of John Lawrence, Shimla was officially declared the summer capital of the British Empire in India, a status it retained up to Indian independence in 1947. During this period, a staggering 1/5 of the human race was ruled from these heights, as the jurisdiction of the Indian Empire extended from Aden in the west to Myanmar in the east. In 1871, the state government of the Punjab also began moving from Lahore to Shimla for the summer months. Expectedly, it was only a matter of time before writers like Rudyard Kipling began giving the town names like Mount Olympus and home of the Little Tin Gods. Right up to the outbreak of the Second World War, Shimla held its own as a place of government. Governance apart, it was also well known for its steamy social life. Here gathered the grass widows, spending a season at Shimla while their husbands sweltered on the plains. Other social ingredients included members of the fishing fleet who sailed out from England in search of husbands. The ones who did not get a wedding band, or at least an engagement ring, were termed returned empties. There were also clubs like the most hospitable Order of Black Hearts, whose members could not commit the offense of living in open matrimony. More sedate entertainment came from the Amateur Dramatic Club, numerous fairs and balls, and a variety of outdoor sports like polo, game hunting, and ice skating. Frivolity aside, Shimla became the hub for national and local freedom fighters. Mahatma Gandhi and other stalwarts came repeatedly for discussions with the colonial government. It's no wonder that at least half a dozen events that have impacted our lives to the present day emerged out of this small town. Queen Victoria's first major war, the First Afghan War, a disaster for the British, was declared from Shimla in 1838. Both the Durand and McMahon lines that marked India's borders emerged out of this town. The Mesopotamian campaign of the First World War was executed from Shimla. The Shimla Conference of 1945 was perhaps the last chance for India to remain undivided, but it failed. In 1946, the cabinet mission arrived here from Britain and opened the way for both independence and partition of the Indian subcontinent. The Boundary Commission, that was to partition India and create Pakistan, had its sittings in Shimla. And more recently, the historic Indo-Pakistan Accord of 1972 was signed here. Municipal governance was introduced as early as 1851. Piped water was available from the 1880s, and hydroelectric power came in the early 20th century. An engineering marvel of its time, the Kalka-Shimla railway line was completed in 1903. One of the world's early automatic telephone exchanges began functioning in Shimla in 1922. Most of Shimla's architectural expressions of colonial lavishness came into being in the last quarter of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th. This largely coincided with what is termed the high noon of the British Empire. In those decades rose huge structures that more or less covered the entire range of the European architectural experience: Neo-Gothic, Neo-Tudor, Swiss Bavarian, Norman Baronial, and elements of Dutch Burger, Rococo, and Baroque. One of these grand homes of Shimla was Bantony, and this is where you are now. In the 1880s, coinciding with the architectural impulse of that period, Raja Shamsher Prakash of Sirmaur purchased several properties in Shimla. One of these was a rundown cottage that belonged to a Captain Gordon. This was demolished. Under the watchful eye of his son and successor, Raja Surendra Bikram Prakash, an impressive mansion came into being. Elaborate foliations and carved brackets that resembled buildings in the Alps were added, as well as delicately wrought turrets and a porch with a filigreed pagoda. Over the years it passed into many hands and became a shadow of its glorious past. Then, in 2017, the Himachal government acquired this estate and structures to create the elaborate complex that Bantony now houses. After all this time, Shimla is now an extraordinary town with a remarkable heritage. It was here that many events of the national movement unfolded, where historic decisions were made, where much of what we are today as a proud and free nation took shape. And today the legacy of Shimla continues as the proud and beautiful capital of a vibrant Himachal Pradesh.